underground on the Tuesday. The European Union's executive is expected to propose Ukraine becomes a formal candidate for EU membership. Meanwhile, a summit's being held in London today to discuss how British companies can help rebuild key infrastructure in Ukraine once the war is over. Ukrainian delegates will meet with British businesses and the International Trade Secretary Anne-Marie Trevelyan. And parts of the UK today could reach up to 34 degrees as the Met Office issues a level 3 heat health alert for London, the east of England and the southeast. Level 3 alerts are issued to help healthcare services prepare for possible increases in demand due to the temperature rises. TV Online and DAB+ Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with the briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Downing Street suggested Prime Minister Boris Johnson may not replace his ethics advisor Lord Geidt with another individual at all, instead perhaps replacing the role with a new body. This is following Geidt's resignation just 2 days ago, of course. The former advisor says he was placed in an impossible and odious position when asked to advise on a plan to protect British steelworks. In his resignation letter, Lord Geidt also said that he chose to stay in his role by a very small margin over Partygate. But that's not the only news in Westminster, of course. Legal challenges continue to dominate the government's Rwanda plan and triggered a conversation about the UK's relationship with the ECHR. Train strikes are set to hit the country next week too. And of course, this is all in the context of a cost of living crisis. The price of fuel, food and goods continues to soar as millions struggle to pay their bills. Well, joining me now is the former Labour MP for Ealing North, Stephen Pound. Welcome to the programme. It's been a very busy week in politics.
Well, there's got to be some good news in there somewhere, hasn't it? I mean, the weather's gorgeous.
It certainly is, at least in the south-east.
And the cricket was quite impressive.
Certainly. Let's get into the details of what exactly has gone on, because to some extent earlier this week, before the resignation of Lord Geidt, a lot of the issues that were dominating the conversation seemed to be pretty good issues for the government. If the government was designing a grid, say, we were talking about rail strikes, which not necessarily good for Labour. We were talking about the Rwanda deportations. We were talking about all sorts of things that might be described as wedge issues.
I think you're absolutely right. And on the Rwanda issue, which I personally think is nonsensical, the fact is you've got 44% national approval for it. Excuse me. And in the so-called red wall seats, you've got a slightly higher one than that. So the business, I mean, you and I probably thought that Partygate had finished. But, I mean, Lord Geidt's letter, I mean, did you see Boris Johnson's response? No, yours faithfully, no, yours, and just Boris Johnson. It's pretty brutal. And, of course, Lord Geidt is now returning to his Hebridean island with his herd of prime sheep, which is he's probably going to be, you know, Boris Johnson wishes he had the same thing. But, look, I take your point. Something has gone seriously and profoundly wrong. I think we're in the end game. I think we're in, the twilight of the gods, or twilight of whatever, at the present time, because inflation is rolling like a boulder down the hill. The cost of borrowing is going to increase massively. That will then affect people's credit. It'll affect the purchasing power, and it's going to have a real problem. I think that Boris Johnson should actually be considering what he's going to do when he's no longer Prime Minister. Because, he's not going to lead the Tories into the next election. They're going to lose the 2 by-elections on Thursday. He's going to be replaced. And he's got no money. He's famously fiscally incontinent. So there was a famous man called the Rector of Stookie back in the 30s. He was a famous priest who got defrocked for immorality. He ended up exhibiting himself in a barrel in fairgrounds until he got eaten by a lion in Blackpool in 1937. So I'm not going to say Boris is going to be, but he's going to try to do the after-dinner speeches. He's going to try to write a few books.
Are we not getting ahead of ourselves?
Oh, yes.
Looking at the way that Westminster has been talking this week, almost a lot of these things that we're talking about now have already been priced in. I think many people expect the Tories to lose those 2 by-elections next Thursday. Many people expected people like Lord Geidt were on the verge of resigning anyway. It's been briefed out to the press enough over the last 6 months, whether it was over curtains, parties or indeed steel tariffs. This seems to be someone who was on the very edge of resigning. I wonder, Was this not all priced into that confidence vote a few weeks ago? And is Boris Johnson, listening to the words of someone like David Frost, pretty safe until Tory party conference? The party's giving him a chance to turn things around.
Well, I think they can't possibly defenestrate him before the 23rd. But the David Frost bandwagon is rolling. There's such a lot of people who are actually pushing and promoting him. But you're one of the few journalists who picked up on the steel tariffs issue. I mean, this is actually a crucial issue, but it seems to have actually gone under the radar for most people. And I think that when Alex Allen, Lord Geit's predecessor, resigned, everybody thought that there's no way that Lord Geit would do the same thing. The old Lady Bracknell, to lose one is unfortunate, but, so I don't think people thought that. I think what they had, and your point about baked in is crucial. People had baked in the fact that Boris is chaotic, he's all over the place, he doesn't do detail, he comes up with these ridiculous garden bridges and God knows what. But I think they'd kind of said, well, OK, Boris is Boris. It's a bit like Tony Blair with John Prescott. Every time Prescott embarrassed,
Tony Blair wasn't necessarily someone who did a great deal of detail. It's interesting looking at these prime ministers, at least since the turn of the century, sort of the ones that have been considered to potentially be the most impactful. Tony Blair, for example, was sort of more of a chairman of a board than a detail policy person. Whereas if you look at Gordon Brown or Theresa May, who really got stuck into the detail, that was potentially their comeuppance.
Gordon Brown was the micromanager to end all micromanagers. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary being in the pre-budget meetings, listening to him, doing the drill down. Tony Blair was, people, used to call him the sofa government. He used to like that sort of collegiate people. Come on, guys, slip your shoes off and let's rap. But other people like Clement Attlee, who was, a minutiae man and very, very successful. So
he only managed to win one election.
He won two, actually, but then he
didn't get a majority of the second. It slips away, yeah.
God, there's no catching you, is there?
That's why a year later there was another election.
Yeah, 1950, 1951.
Yeah.
And you were a brush on your mother's cheek.
Certainly was. You can't have been able to, you weren't a political player in the 1951.
No. The National Health Service and I were both born in July 1948. So,
wow. That's a good line. Back to exactly what's going on next week now, because we're expecting some train strikes. And this is potentially going to be a tricky time for the Labour Party, who haven't been able to explicitly condemn this. They're sort of trying to have it both ways, saying they wish the strikes were not going ahead, but not saying that they outright oppose them.
No, it is very, very difficult. You see, people still associate the RMT with the Labour Party. The RMT is not affiliated to the Labour Party. The RMT supports candidates who stand against the Labour Party. The RMT is interested in destruction of global capitalism, I think.
Why doesn't the Labour Party just condemn the strikes there?
Because there's still an absolute visceral loyalty within the Labour Party, because we are the Labour Party, the party of Labour. And, we're not, even though we're a social democratic party, we're actually the party of Labour. I think, and I think a lot of people do, that there's probably more traction to be gained from being the party of the commuters, rather than the party of the strikers.
Because, of course, there's lots of people who are trying to get to work next week, whether they be nurses, teachers, even school children who have exams next week. It does seem that the RMT are putting themselves in a very unpopular position. I just find it very hard to understand why people like the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, are saying they would vote for the strikes were they a member of the RMT.
I thought that's extraordinary. But the RMT have always taken the old Millwall, nobody loves us and we don't care line. I mean, if their last two leaders have both been, in fact, one of them was a Millwall supporter. So I think the Labour Party could do a lot more, but ultimately what you have to do is to say these things must be resolved by negotiation. The RMT and ASLEF and TSSA to a certain extent have actually put all their tanks on the lawn at the start of the issue. What any decent negotiator does is actually lead and then build up if necessary. What you don't do is to throw all your money on one spin of the dice. And I think it's a naive bit of politics and a naive bit of industrial relations. So is that why the Labour Party is reluctant? I don't know. I think the Labour Party still feels this kind of almost sentimental emotional attachment in some cases, even though, the RMT will do their level best to destroy the Labour Party.
Really interesting there, because the Labour Party seems to be changing in some ways, but incapable of changing in other ways. Is Keir Starmer potentially a bit of a transitional leader here? Is he the Neil Kinnock rather than the Tony Blair, changing the party in some ways, but maybe not enough to get it over the line?
It's interesting. I mean, Keir Starmer was actually born and steeped in Labour Party history, named after Keir Hardie, his family, passionately Labour. So he's very much a Labour man, and I think he feels, as I do, there's still feeling that, there's a sort of also paternal feeling towards organised Labour, which is very, very difficult to break. As for whether he's transitional or not, I think the transitional Labours were people like David Owen, who actually transitioned us into a cul-de-sac. But the reality is that right back to Tony Crosland, right back to the 1950s, people have been saying, is Labour still the party of the massed factory meetings? Because we don't have the mines, we don't have the docks, we don't have the steelworks. We don't, I mean, when I was active in politics, back in the 60s and 70s, I used to address meetings of hundreds of people at factory gates. You don't do that anymore. So this is probably one of the, maybe not for today, but it's a huge question about the ultimate realignment. As we come into retail politics nowadays, the old loyalties, and we were talking about the 1950s, I think it was the 1955 election, 91% of the people in this country voted for one of the two main parties. It's extraordinary.
And now there's much wider selection, I suppose.
It's pick and mix.
Many things, and we'll see that on Thursday, of course, because we're expecting Lib Dem opposition in the southwest, Labour opposition to the government, of course, in the north.
Nightmare, isn't it?
But I'm afraid we have run to the end of the conversation there, Stephen Pound. I really appreciate your time this morning, but we've got to get on to the other things. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure, Tom.
Grand. Well, now moving on to our next story. First Minister of Scotland, Nicolas Sturgeon, says that she wants a referendum rerun before the end of next year. Her Constitution Minister, Angus Robinson, has indicated that it could take place as early as October 2023, with further details on the roadmap for partitioning Britain to be released in the coming weeks. Sturgeon claimed that her government had a, quote, indisputable mandate to rerun the vote she previously described as once in a lifetime. But is there something else going on here? This morning, Spectator editor Fraser Nelson has written in the Telegraph newspaper saying Sturgeon's demands for another referendum are simply a bluff, an act of political theatre to keep her troops hopeful while the case for separatism slowly implodes. Well, let's explore what's really going on now with political analyst and co-founder of Message Matters, Andy McIver. Welcome to the programme, Andy. I suppose, first of all, one of the big questions is why on earth did Nicola Sturgeon choose this week to launch her big referendum push? I believe we're having a little bit of a trouble getting through there to Andy McIver, so let's move on to our next guest in the meantime. To international relations, Baroness Stroud has tabled an amendment to the procurement bill this week that seeks to ban government departments from procuring goods in the regions of the world that, quote, are tainted by slavery and human trafficking. No prizes for guessing where they might have in mind. Interestingly, the amendment reportedly has the support of some in the Cabinet. Well, let's get more on this now. Joining me is Luke de Pulford, human rights campaigner and director and co-founder of the London-based anti-slavery charity Arise. Welcome to the programme. I suppose it's interesting looking here. This isn't about the generality of imports to the United Kingdom. This is about what the government procures. Why that distinction?
Well, because government is a huge purchaser of goods, and they tend to set the standard for what commerce does more broadly. So if the government decides that it's going to impose higher human rights standards for its procurement for the things that it buys, that's going to have an overwhelming effect on what business does more generally. So government is a huge purchaser, and we're talking tens of billions of pounds a year going into companies which are operating, I would say, in some of the the worst parts of the world for human rights abuse. We often don't have that kind of visibility. What this amendment is trying to do is say, hang on a second, you can't go around pointing the finger at countries who are perpetrating huge human rights abuses while funneling a load of public cash into them. So that's what this amendment is seeking to address.
It's interesting looking at the definitions in this amendment. How do we qualify what is tainted by slavery, and how far do these regions stretch? Is there something that is specifically laid out in the wording there, or is this open to interpretation?
So I think there are two parts to this amendment, and they should be treated quite distinctly, even though they're related. So the broad effort is about supply chain resilience. There are many ways of defining that. You're not resilient if you're very dependent on authoritarian states, and you're not very resilient if you're dependent on human rights abusers. The amendment is addressing both things. What it does, and what I think is quite smart, is it tries to incorporate the thinking of our integrated review, which was the UK government's attempt to try to understand geopolitics. And what they do in that review, what the government does, is it categorises states, categorises threats, people like Iran, North Korea, Russia, and categorises systemic competitors, China. where we have the biggest import problem, in my view, from a human rights point of view. So what this amendment does is it says, look, if we're dependent in key industries upon these countries, we've got a problem. We're going to find ourselves in the situation that we found ourselves with Ukraine, with China and with other difficult states.
So this is about the entire countries, not just parts of these countries, because of course there's been a lot of discussion over the Hubei province within China. This would be something that applied to the country as a whole, the second largest economy in the world.
Yes, it would, but it is more nuanced than that. Because what it does is it says, OK, if you're importing something from China which has got a problem, a particular human rights problem, you want to be aware of that. Of course you do. You don't want to be taking public tax money and funneling it into the hands of human rights abusers. Similarly, you don't want to be so blanket as to say we can't trade with China, but there are other concerns. For example, with solar panels, the key ingredient for solar panels is polysilicon, and it comes overwhelmingly from one region of China, which is Xinjiang. We're talking about 80% of the world's supply. So we are, because of our legislation around renewables, completely reliant on that region for solar panels. Well, that's an intolerable situation to be in. We have to be looking at diversifying our supply away from regions like that. Otherwise, we're effectively beholden to human rights abusers for key industries like renewables.
And what would you say to those who say that, sort of in a post-Brexit world, the United Kingdom needs to be opening up to trade around the world? And whilst this may be an amendment that has noble intentions, the knock-on effects of this may well be to close the economy off in too many areas.
Well, I disagree on two bases. First of all, we should never, I think, prioritise our trading opportunities over our values. I think that has to be point number one. Now, there's always a bit of tension there. When you've got a country that's committing a genocide in that very region, we shouldn't be dependent upon them for a key industry. So that would be point number one. Point number two is that actually, no, this is an opportunity to say to the rest of the world, why don't you start developing these kinds of things too, if you can? India, huge market for us, that is developing all kinds of capabilities around precisely these sorts of industries. We should be encouraging that, looking at ways that wean us off dependency on countries like China, which we define as a systemic competitor, by the way. And even that, in my mind, is a very weak categorisation.
Interesting that. And so just finally, what are the chances of this amendment getting through? It doesn't have formal government backing, and that's always a very tricky legislative path. But we are hearing there is some support, not least potentially private support within the cabinet.
Yeah, so we hear positive rumblings, and it's pretty clear that after Sajid Javid pushed forward an amendment to the Health and Care Act on this very subject, and by the way, this amendment incorporates substantially the wording of that amendment. You know, it's quite clear that there is support within government, and we're hearing other rumours as well. But I think the key thing is that this amendment that Baroness Stroud is pushing forward, you know, courageously was worked up with the support of a pre-packaged rebellion in the Commons. So we know where this is going. If the government doesn't come to the table and start negotiating now, they're going to have a major headache further down the road.
Really interesting stuff. Well, we'll follow the progress of that amendment. Luke de Fulford, for now, thank you so much for coming in and explaining that really interesting issue there in international affairs. Well, now, it may be very warm in some parts of our United Kingdom today, but come the autumn, energy costs and heating will be back at the top of the agenda. So, with the government having promised to build the equivalent of a new nuclear reactor every single year, how close are we to that promised nuclear revolution to increase supply and bring down costs? Joining me now is Tom Gretex, the CEO of the Nuclear Industry Association. Thanks for joining me this morning, Tom. I suppose the government's gone a little bit quiet on this issue in recent weeks. How close are we? How far along the road are we to this supposed nuclear revolution?
Well, there's a lot of activity going on, Tom. You'll have seen, possibly will have seen over the course of the last few days, announcements in relation to the funding mechanism for the project at Sizewell, which is likely to be the next one to get started. We're moving towards a final decision on that project. The Rolls-Royce UK SMR consortium that started the regulatory process for getting the reactor design approved. And actually the commitment was about approving the equivalent of one reactor a year over the next few years, and then the delivery will come after that. And it's really important getting those things in place. The new vehicle, Great British Nuclear, there's work going on to get that set up and established. So there's a lot going on. It might not have quite caught the headlines in the same way, but it doesn't mean that there's nothing happening.
Approval process, because of course it's not just that the government needs to sanction this, there is also substantial amounts of funding that needs to be secured, and the private public mix of that is always a bone of contention. Frankly, nuclear is expensive. How are we going to pay for it all?
Well, it isn't expensive. It's the cheapest electricity that's currently on the grid comes from our existing fleet. The reason for that is because they're power stations that are towards the end of their life. The capital cost has been paid, and they're now generating electricity which is sold into the grid at £45 a megawatt hour, which is much, much lower than the current market price, or the market price has been for a very long period of time. So it's not that the electricity is expensive, but what uses a lot of capital is the construction. Nearly all of the money associated with nuclear power plants is in the construction and getting them built, getting them done. And that's where the tricky issue has become around the financing mechanism. The regulated asset base, which has been legislated for and will likely be used for Sizewell and other projects, both does two things. It reduces the cost of capital because revenues released during the course of construction, and secondly, it opens it up to a greater pool of capital, and there's a lot more investors and banks interested in nuclear now. They can see that mechanism's in place. But ultimately, what it means is, you pay up front to enable you to have a lot of electricity delivered from a very small geographical footprint for a very, very long period of time, probably 80 years. So, way beyond our lifetimes, those power stations, the next generation of power stations, will be producing electricity and helping to ensure that we don't have what we've got at the moment, which is an overexposure to the volatility of fossil fuel prices.
Certainly. And when could we be able to see these first new large-scale reactors come online? Because I suppose we've got about a decade to wean ourselves off some of this hydrocarbon-based energy, and we may well be using gas for the next 10 years or so. By the time we have weaned off that, will nuclear have taken the baseload?
Well, nuclear will almost certainly be around between a fifth and a quarter of our long-term electricity mix in the future. And in terms of delivery, that will be over the course of the next decade. There will be a lot. And if we do what the government has said they want to do, which is approve one a year now, in 10 years' time, we'll be opening one a year. And we'll be making sure that we have, the bit of firm power that we need in our mix that isn't reliant on the weather, which is really important as a baseload, as you said, that we've got that in place, because the danger is not doing that. We have the huge volatility in prices, but also potentially volatility in supply, and that causing issues with the system and ensuring that we've got a regulated supply, which is what you crucially need. You do not want to be in a position where you have cuts in supply, or doing what's happening in Australia at the moment, as you might have seen, which is people being appealed to not use electricity between 6 and 8 in the evening because of the issues they've got in their capacity. We want to avoid that. Best way of avoiding that is having some firm power as part of your mix, and that's what nuclear can provide. We could have been in a much better position if we made some of these decisions 10, 15 years ago, but we are where we are. We've got to make sure we're going to be in a better position in 10 years' time.
I suppose the tricky thing with all of these projects that last 10 years or more is that politicians are intrinsically short-termist. Making these long-term investment decisions is always trickier for them to do. We've only got 30 seconds left on the programme, Tom Greatox, but I just wonder if you could say a word about potentially some of these faster, smaller modular reactors. Where are we with these?
So Rolls-Royce is the UK consortium. They're underway in getting through the approval process. Rolls-Royce can deliver that, they say, by the end of this decade, if decisions are taken. Things happen in parallel. Don't wait to get the GDA before you start looking at sites. Do all that now. Get the factory sites identified. Then you can build them and can have them in place. Interesting,
but still 10 years. I didn't know that point. That's really, really crucial development to hear. We'll have to have you on again to talk through it more. Tom Greatox of the Nuclear Industry Association, thanks for joining us. Well, that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys. But first, here's the weather.
Hello. For many areas, Friday is looking like another dry and fine day with plenty of sunshine, and temperatures will be higher still for many areas as well. So for England, Wales, hot and humid, but cooler across the north with some rain. If we look at the pressure pattern, then you can see high pressure centred to the east of the UK, and that's dragging in some very warm air from the south, from the near continent, shown by the red on the maps. But it will be cooler across Scotland and Northern Ireland. That's thanks to this area of low pressure that's gradually pushing in. So we will see outbreaks of rain spreading in across much of Scotland, Northern Ireland. Some of that rain could be heavy with a strengthening breeze as well. But whilst it will slowly push its way southwards, it won't affect much of England and Wales through the day. So we're looking at a fine picture here, lots of lovely sunshine to come. And with that southerly wind that I mentioned, temperatures really will soar. So widely across England and Wales, we're looking at temperatures reaching the high 20s or low 30s. In the southeast,